Hello and welcome back to the Mike's On with College Football podcast. I'm your host, Mike Collins, and today we are getting into the SEC East preview. Right on. So to start, we're going to be looking at the University of Kentucky. They finished at 10-3 last year and they lose four of their top five wide receivers. Number one being Wan'Dale Robinson, who had 1,334 receiving yards last year, which was 40% of the team's total. He went in round 2 of the NFL draft to the New York Giants. They also lost Josh Ali, who had 600 reception yards. They also lose 3 offensive line starters, 2 of them to the NFL, and 2 starters at defensive back. No key injuries here to really note during training camp. However, they do return a good bit. All 5 running backs return on this roster. 71.3% of the yards on offense they produced last year are all coming back. Top running back Christopher Rodriguez is returning. He had 1,300 yards last year with 9 touchdowns. They also have a pro prospect at quarterback, Will Levis. He is a junior. He had just shy of 3,000 yards last year, 24 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, and a 66% passing completion rate. However, they only bring back 46 offensive line starts. They did lose a lot at O-line. They do have a new coach, offensive coordinator Rick Scangarella from the NFL, and offensive line coach Zach Yanzer. Looking at the schedule here, for sure wins, home against Miami of Ohio, at University of Florida, Youngstown State, home against Northern Illinois, at Missouri, and Vanderbilt. For sure wins there. Only for sure loss I see on the schedule for them is Georgia, and the 50-50s on the schedule, we've got at Ole Miss, Mississippi State. They get both Mississippis this year. Interesting. And at Tennessee, as well as home against Louisville. That's a rivalry game throughout the records. Louisville hasn't won that one probably since Lamar Jackson, but they bring back a lot this year, so it could be pretty interesting. Really what I'm thinking about for this Kentucky team is they're returning an NFL talent at quarterback in Levis, who will help support a wide receiver core that's pretty depleted. Granted, they did bring in some transfers, and the depth is there from the younger players from last year. They might have to lean on Levis's arm more with the offensive line kind of being so green and inexperienced, even though the running backs are deep. Defense should remain stout against the run and improve against the pass. Interesting juxtaposition, as I said, between returning production at running back and lack thereof at offensive line. Gotta trust the development and the recruiting there at offensive line. Kentucky under Mark Stoops has put together at multiple offensive linemen into the NFL. This has become an offensive line factory here at Kentucky, and you got to just trust Stoops on this one to have the boys in the trenches ready to roll for the next season. Going on through the division, we next have Tennessee, the Vols, who last season finished at 7-6. Bit of an up and down year for the Vols, but they did score a lot of points, so that's fun. They do lose Velus Jones, 807 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. He went in the 3rd round of the NFL draft to Chicago. They also lose a deep threat in Javonte Payton, who had 18 receptions for 413 yards. So when he caught the ball, it was way down the field. And they lose right tackle Cade Mays, who went to Carolina Panthers in the 6th round. They lose 1 starter apiece at at linebacker and defensive back, respectfully, both to the NFL. Key injuries is backup running back Laneith Whitehead. He is out for the year with an injury, but they do have some depth there, so it shouldn't be a huge concern, but they're dinged up early there at running back. Returning production, we've got 8 starters coming back on offense, 7 on defense. At least 70%, they return at least 70% of their production last year in returning offensive yards, the amount of tackles they had on defense, as well as their sacks, tackles for loss, and interceptions. So they return a lot on defense. Just a ton of their production in tackles as well as just havoc plays on defense. They have 91 offensive line starts returning, and they return Hendon Hooker, who is a sixth-year senior, an excellent dual-threat quarterback who won the job in Week 3 last season. No new coaches there, and we're going on to the schedule. I've got some for sure wins for Tennessee. Ball State, Akron, Florida, UT Martin, all those at home, as well as Missouri at home and at Vanderbilt. The only for sure losses I see on this schedule are at Georgia and Alabama at home. 50-50s on the schedule. Early game against Pitt, at LSU, home against Kentucky, and at South Carolina. This is the best-looking Tennessee team in a long time, with this much production returning. The ceiling is very high for a team that scores as much as the Vols do, averaging almost 40 a game last season. If the defense can take a step forward in their pass defense, then this could be a renaissance year in Knoxville. And I will say, last year Hendon Hooker was an absolute gamer at quarterback. Last year Hendon Hooker was a complete leader on offense for the Vols. He was a maestro in conducting this high-flying passing attack that Josh Heupel puts together. You've got receivers. If you watch Tennessee this year, please do, because you're going to see receivers closer to the sideline than you've ever seen. They spread them out, and it really puts the stress on defenses. So I have for the Vols this year 9-3 or 10-2. I think they should contend for the East Division. I think they're the 3 team in the East behind Kentucky and Georgia. Big thing for the Vols is make it close in November. Get into November where you've got last 3 games of the year, Missouri at South Carolina at Vanderbilt. Those are all very gettable games coming off November 5th at Georgia. Win your last 3, put yourself in position in the first half of the schedule to be in contention, and it could get interesting for the Vols come in November. Next up in the division, we've got South Carolina, the Cocks. Finished last year at 7-6, which, to be honest, for how poorly they looked early, was a real miracle they could turn it around and get bowl eligible and even beat a rival UNC in the Duke's Mayo Bowl, which was huge for that program. They do lose a good bit. They lose running backs 1 and 2, who both for a total of 1,200 yards. However, they do add a Wake Forest transfer, Christian Beal-Smith. They lose their number 1 tight end, but they replace him with transfer from Oklahoma, Austin Stogner. They lose 3 starters on the defensive line, 1 to the NFL, and lose QB depth with 2 part-time starters leaving, totaling 1,400 yards. QB was a revolving door for this team last year and wildly inconsistent. They were so banged up at QB early in the season that they actually had to start a grad transfer from North Dakota State University in Zeb Noland. He did okay. They put in a true freshman who really struggled through the season. This year, big splash on the transfer portal. They add Oklahoma, NFL QB1, top flight prospect in Spencer Rattler. He was with Lincoln Riley over the past 2 years at Oklahoma and has probably the best arm in college football. He can make every single throw. His demeanor was questioned, and his ability to get along with teammates was questioned as well in his freshman and into his sophomore year, where he was actually benched for Caleb Williams. So he comes for a fresh start here to South Carolina, and I would say Spencer's probably grown up. After all that he's gone through at Oklahoma, being benched and now transferring, he's going to be playing big boy ball in the SEC, and I think he's ready for the challenge, especially with what he has to work with. No key injuries here, and the returning production is 129 starts on the offensive line. They return 3 starters in the defensive backfield, as well as 9 starters on offense with the offensive linemen there, and 5 on defense. No new news in the coaching area, and for the schedule, we've got for sure wins at home against Georgia State, home against Charlotte, home against South Carolina State, and home against Missouri, and another one at Vanderbilt. For sure losses on the schedule. Unfortunately for South Carolina, their in-state rival is Clemson, and they also have to play Georgia every year. So those are going to be 2 losses off the rip. And from this year, from the opposite side, from the SEC West, they unfortunately draw Texas A&M. So I've got all those 3 as losses for the Gamecocks. Some 50-50s on the schedule. At Arkansas, at Kentucky, at Florida, and home against Tennessee. Now, at Florida is near the end of the year, and as well as at Vanderbilt. So those are 2 gettable games late for the Cox. Big thing for me with this South Carolina team. They have the highest ceiling of any team in the SEC, probably sans Georgia. They could definitely punch up and get ahead of Tennessee if things click right. With the addition of Spencer Rattler, the QB play at South Carolina is elevated immensely. That will transfer to an offense who only averaged 23 points last year. With a strong offensive line and a lot of starts returning, the offense should look to improve on a very lackluster 2021. Defensive line will be a question mark to enter the season, and the defense might actually take a step back, whereas last year they really held this team. They held this team in games for the most part with the offense struggling so much. So you could see a flip of script with South Carolina being more offensively focused and just trying to win shootouts, which I think is the way to go for this team. If you're going to be bringing in Spencer Rattler and you've got decent amount of wide receivers and running backs on this team, you should be trying to just chuck the ball around and see what happens. 6-6 and 7-5 is the goal here. Back-to-back bowl seasons would be huge in South Carolina, and we'd love to see this team punch up and grab one of A&M at Clemson or home against Georgia. They've done it before, definitely in the Will Muschamp era of South Carolina. They would punch up and grab Georgia or Clemson, or just he had a knack of making those big-time games against big-time opponents really down in the muck and gritty. Maybe not this team will do it that way, but I definitely think South Carolina is always one of those teams you can't count out. You can't count out in every single big game that they play. They're going to come up and surprise somebody. And with Spencer Rattler at quarterback, they definitely have the opportunity to do so. Definitely watching a lot of Gamecocks this year. It should be really exciting. That brings us to Georgia. The Dogs finished 14-1 last year with a national title victory, first one since 1980. However, they do lose a lot from that team. Zamir White, a running back, as well as James Cook, both to the NFL, and with their backup wide receiver transfers to Alabama. They lose J.T. Daniels, their backup quarterback. He transfers to West Virginia, and they lose 2 starters on the offensive line, both to the NFL, and they lose 9 players on defense, all to the NFL. This was one of the best defenses that have ever played college football last year, especially in the front 7. They lose 3 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, and 3 defensive backs, all to the NFL. Key injuries, they've got 2 freshman wide receivers out for the early part of the season, so depth of concern there early. And the returning production, they only returned 62 offensive line starts. Now, the recruiting has been great under Kirby Smart, so I imagine the guys waiting in the wings are ready to roll for this Dogs team. And they return below 50% of the tackles, as well as tackles for loss, sacks, and interceptions from one of the best defenses of all time, as I stated. They do have a new coach. Their defensive coordinator, Dan Lanning, left for a head coaching job at Oregon, and their new co-DC is Glenn Schumann, as well as Will Muschamp, coming back to the SEC to call some ball. He's a great defensive coordinator. I imagine with the amount of talent that is on this Georgia team, they're going to be doing some pretty disgusting stuff on defense. It's going to be, just because they lose all this talent doesn't mean this is going to be a pushover of a team on defense. For sure wins for the Dogs, I've got home against Samford, at South Carolina, Kent State, at Missouri, home against Auburn, Vanderbilt, Florida, and Tennessee, at Mississippi State, and home against Georgia Tech. I don't see any for sure losses on this schedule. However, the 50-50 game I have for them is at Kentucky. Now, at Kentucky for the Dogs is going to be at the end of the season. If everything goes right for UK as well as Georgia, that game could decide the East. At Kentucky, late in the season, November 19th. Could be cold and rainy and just a really nasty weather game. Who knows? However, my only caveat here with that game being a 50-50 is if Kentucky keeps Will Levis healthy and he is playing that game. With that game potentially having so many stakes with it, I give it a 50-50. Georgia comes off its first national title since 1980 and loses a ton on defense. However, the recruiting has been elite over the past 4 to 5 years with Kirby Smart. So the players that move in are still extremely talented. Georgia has done a great job at rotating players in both offense and defensively in the past years, so the new starters aren't lacking for experience. Georgia is the team to beat in the East. Prediction and reasonable goals for this team: 10-2 or 11-1, return to the SEC championship. Anything less, I think, is a slight disappointment on the season. If they drop to only 9 wins, that means they are dropping a game against maybe at Mississippi State. They do run the air raid. That's not something you see every week in the SEC. And then maybe they're losing home to Auburn. 9-3 would be very interesting, considering this is a very soft schedule for Georgia. They also opened the year against Oregon, and I would put that down as a 50-50 as well. Next up, we've got Florida, who finished at 6-7 last year. They lose quarterback Emory Jones, who transferred to Arizona State, as well as 2 starters on the offensive line. They also lose a running back to the NFL, who accounted for 60% of the team's rush yards, as well as wide receivers 1, 3, 5, and 6, who accounted for 50% of the team's receiving yards. They lose 5 defensive linemen, 1 to the NFL, 4 linebackers, and 1 cornerback to the NFL. Injuries to this team: starting cornerback Jaden Hill is out for the first half of the season. Returning production: they returned 6 offensive starters and 7 on defense, as well as 98 returning starts on the offensive line. They returned 60% of their lettermen, so people that contributed to the team last year. However, they are sub 45% on tackles returning. Florida really loses a lot of its depth to the transfer portal in a year where they turned over at head coach. Head coach Dan Mullen was fired, and new coach Billy Napier was hired from Louisiana. He brought with him Rob Sale, as well as Patrick Tooney from University of Louisiana Lafayette. Rob Sale being the offensive coordinator, the offensive line coach, and Patrick Tooney being co-defensive coordinator, along with Sean Spencer. They bring in Chris Couch at special teams coordinator. For sure wins for this Florida team: home against University of Southern Florida, home against Eastern Washington, as well as Missouri, and at Vanderbilt. Losses on this schedule: I see home against Georgia, at Texas A&M, home against Kentucky. They draw, unfortunately, LSU from the opposite division, and that's a home game. And their opener against Utah, which is this upcoming game Saturday, we'll talk more about that tomorrow, or maybe today, depending on when this video comes out, is also a for sure loss. I think Utah is really going to pound this team out. Schedule 50-50 is only one, home against South Carolina. That game can kind of go either way. Florida loses a lot in a coaching change year I have here. Added some pieces from the portal, but are super thin at defensive tackle. Probably only 2 deep at defensive tackle, in a conference that likes to pound the ball and has really good offensive lines. This is a retooling year for the Gators under first-year head coach Billy Napier. However, on the bright side, they do return a super athletic redshirt sophomore quarterback, Anthony Richardson, who could make some hay in a Billy Napier system that featured mobile QBs last year with University of Louisiana Lafayette. They produced Levi Lewis, who went on to get undrafted but signed with went to training camp with the Seattle Seahawks. For this team, 4-8 or 5-7. Going to a bowl would be a fever dream of a season for the Florida Gators this year. Looking to just put some positive film on tape for this team and kind of get through the season and get into recruiting. It's a bit of a rebuild here under Billy Napier, as Dan Mullen really didn't hit the recruiting trail that hard in his last few years at Florida. Up next, Vanderbilt. We talked about them just recently. It was a big win over Hawaii. Last year, however, they finished 2-10, and they do lose wide receivers 1, 3, and 5, who account for 102 receptions for about 1,100 yards. They also lose 2 starting offensive linemen, 1 transferred to Alabama to start. So they lose an SEC caliber starting offensive lineman to transfer. That's tough in conference. And 5 backup offensive linemen. They also lose depth at defensive line and at cornerback. Key injuries, redshirt freshman defensive end Miles Capers, who's a bit of a backup. He is out for the year. They return 7 offensive starters and 7 defensive starters. They also return 81 yards of their offensive yards from last season and almost all of their quarterbacks, as well as 81 offensive line starts. So the offense looks to be pretty potent this year with that much returning production. They do have a new head coach in defensive coordinator Nick Howell. And for sure wins on the season, we've got at Hawaii, home against Elon, at Northern Illinois, which should be a big game. I'm putting that as a for sure win, but that is no easy feat, defeating a Northern Illinois team that got a little lucky last year in some turnover luck and play a bit of a ground and pound game. But still, they're no pushover out there in the MAC. And not at Kentucky is not a for sure win. That is a typo. At Kentucky is a for sure loss. There it is. At Alabama, for sure lost. Home against Ole Miss, for sure loss. As well as at Georgia, at University of Kentucky, and home against Tennessee. Some 50-50s on the schedule. Games where I think Vandy, maybe it's not 50-50, but they have a better chance of winning than probably 30%. Home against Wake Forest, at Missouri, home against South Carolina, and home against Florida. Maybe not so against South Carolina and Florida, but it's not a less than 20%, less than 15% chance. I think there's a real shot that Vanderbilt can get some of those wins later in the season there, especially South Carolina at home on the November 5th and home against Florida late in the season. That Florida team might be so depleted with injuries that maybe they're able to pound the rock against them, and maybe Florida has kind of packed it in for the year. In year 2 of Clark Lee, Vanderbilt looks to see some proof of concept from this team. Depth is shaky at offensive line and defensive line, and the gaps there were filled with transfers, especially on the offensive line. A win in conference would be huge for this team, as well as going 4-0 in the non-conference. QB Mike Wright is an absolute stud of an athlete at quarterback, but will need to see consistency in his passing game for Vandy to be able to punch above its weight during the season. Reasonable expectations for a Vanderbilt Commodores team here. 3-9 or 4-8. And big goal for the season for this team is win a conference game, or at least have a couple just 3 to 4 just close scares of conference foes, really scare some teams into thinking, wow, we probably should have lost that game to Vanderbilt. Probably would be not that fun for a Vanderbilt fan, but at least you're showing some life here in the conference. Last but not least in the SEC East, we are looking at the Missouri Tigers, who finished an okay 6-7. They do lose running back one, Tyler Batty, 1,600 rush yards to the NFL. QB Connor Bazelak, who had 2,500 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. He is gone in the transfer portal to the University of Indiana. They lose an NFL caliber cornerback and some depth in the defensive back room. No key injuries coming out of camp for the Missouri Tigers. And returning production, 6 offensive starters, 8 defensive starters. They have 83 starts that return on the offensive line and 8 with starting experience. So a lot of transfers from other teams coming in. A lot of guys on the offensive line have started games but haven't been consistent starters. They do have a new coach. His defensive coordinator, Blake Baker, comes in to revamp this defense. For sure wins pretty much everything in the non-con plus Vanderbilt, Louisiana Tech, Abilene Christian, Vanderbilt, and New Mexico State. They are all home games. For sure losses, at Auburn, home against Georgia, at Tennessee, at Kansas State. Why you schedule a Big 12 team? Well, I guess because you're Missouri and you're near the Big 12, but still, non-con SEC team. Not the best idea to schedule another Power 5 program, as well as home against Kentucky. Some 50-50s on the schedule. At Florida, at South Carolina, and home against Arkansas. Arkansas is a bit of a rivalry for them. Hasn't gone great. Well, Arkansas used to be pretty bad, so a bit of an up and down there, back and forth, and rivalry games throw the records out. So I got a couple thoughts on Missouri. They're in an interesting spot, and I almost have a challenge for them. In Eli Drinkowitz's third year, Missouri is still a mystery at QB and loses a top-flight running back. Depth is there at running back, but will someone emerge? Offensive line is still patching it together in his third year with all these transfers, and the defense returns some starters and adds depth, but the question is, where is this program going? Do we just tread water and strive for bowl eligibility? Missouri is a classic example of a team in conference realignment who took the big money check from the conference TV deals in exchange for consistently being at the bottom to a middling team in the conference. Drinkowitz is an excellent offensive mind, but the talent still isn't there for the Tigers to take a big leap forward this year. And just Missouri has been to this. If they go to a bowl game this year, it'll be their 8th straight year making a bowl game, with none of those wins being above 8 in a season in those past years. So they're just consistently just getting to a bowl game or a few games ahead. Past results in 2017 and forward: 7-6, 8-5, 6-6, 5-5 in the COVID year, and 6-7 in 2021. So a very just plodding along, bowl eligible team. 6-6, 7-5 for me for this team again. I think they probably will make a bowl game for an 8th straight year. Yay, but where do we want to be? Don't let Vandy be your first conference win on October 22nd, and that is huge as we look to the schedule. The non-conference isn't too bad for Missouri, as they start with Louisiana Tech, at Kansas State, home against Abilene Christian, probably 2-1, best case 3-0 there. And then they start conference play with a couple toughies. At Auburn, home against Georgia, at Florida, and then the bye week. You've got to find a win there. The easiest one being at Florida, but that early in the season, maybe Florida is still rolling and has some confidence in them. After the bye week, you've got homecoming against Vanderbilt. If that's your first win in conference, it's going to be tough to make the bowl game. That means you're best case scenario, 3-3 after the bye, 4 wins with Vanderbilt, and you've got to grab basically one more because you're probably going to beat New Mexico State at home late in the season. So you've got to grab one of Arkansas at Tennessee, Kentucky at South Carolina. All not easy games, especially at South Carolina that late in the season. They might be fighting for bowl eligibility themselves. So it's a competitive race down the stretch for the Tigers and the teams they face. They probably will grab one of those, but again, are we just trying to get to 6-6, go to a bowl game, and yay, we did it? It's not like basketball at Missouri is really killing it. They do like their football there over in Missouri. So maybe it's just one more year. They are breaking in a new quarterback here. Well, he had some play last year, but Brady Cook, the sophomore, bit of a learning year for him. Maybe he pops off, maybe he doesn't, and then we'll check back in with the Tigers next year. But in a third year for Eli Drinkowitz, you'd kind of want a little more consistency, especially on the offensive side of the ball. So hopefully the Tigers make a bowl, but when are they going to start challenging in the East? All right, guys, that does it for the SEC East preview. Thanks for joining me. As always, I'm Mike Collins with the Mike's On with College Football podcast. You guys can follow me on Twitter at MikeOnCFP. That's Mike's On CFP on Twitter. I post there all the videos that I'm going to post onto YouTube as well as what I'm working on. And on Saturday, I'll live tweet a lot of the games that I'm watching, and feel free to contact me there. Hit me with questions. You want to know about your team, what they're going to be doing this season, or questions about the NCAA in general. I'm happy to field anything and everything. Thanks so much, and have a great one.